I'm really pleased to be joined by a friend and a colleague from the University of Bradford, Dr. Mark Goodall, who is senior lecturer in film. Hi, Mark, how are you?
I'm very well, David, thank you.
Well, thanks for joining me this morning. And we're here to talk about angry young men.
Yes.
And that whole movement, British New Wave, and we'll get into the terminology a little bit in a moment. And this is all part of Seminci, the retrospective 65th anniversary of British Free Cinema at the Valladolid International Film Festival. And there's a range of films that we're going to kind of just have a little look over that they're going to show. But if we can go back to that title of Angry Young Men and kind of that whole movement really about where the Angry Young Men sort of collective name came from and how that meets British New Wave. At a time when, this is between 1950s and 1960s, a time when culture in the UK was having there was a real rebirth of culture and an explosion of popular culture, it's fair to say. You know, Glenn Miller was no longer in the charts, it was Bill Haley and the Comets, rock and roll, birth of the teenager. Is this whole film movement part of that journey? Was it inspired by that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was part of a general post-war mood of that especially amongst younger people, that things had to change, and that the landscape of culture, certainly across Europe, you know, needed to be reinvented. So I think those things you've talked about, music, art, film was you know, another one of those aspects of culture that had to change and change quite radically. So plus, alongside all the sort of deeper things that were going on, sort of philosophical debates about, you know, man's place in the world that were reflected in movements like existentialism, you know, philosophical movements, which had a huge influence on a lot of European film in the post-war period. So yeah, I think it was definitely something in the air, to coin a phrase, that was really significant. At first glance, you know, the phrase "angry young men" is, and the characters in most of the films that are in this program are male characters. The idea of the existential figure, the post-war existential figure, is usually a male one in the, you know, in the plays and the books and the novels, the writings that were of that time. But it's quite interesting that you know, the people that formed the free cinema movement, one of them, Lorenza Mazzetti, was female, and her film was one of the best received films from that movement, her film Together, which was directed by her, but also was curious because it had two deaf-mute characters. So it was very radical. And it just, but so I think it's kind of, it would be a good legacy of the movement would be to see how those other voices have transferred through to present day filmmaking, or not, you know, things that have improved, but perhaps not improved enough. So yeah, just the interesting, the language, you know, the angry young men thing. Perhaps that's now a bit redundant, and it's a wider group of people that are angry. There's some very significant female characters in the films, you know, thinking of the female characters in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, or A Taste of Honey. It's not that they're absent, but they're and lots of them went on to be very successful actors. But yeah, it's the person behind the camera. I don't know how much that's changed.
No.
Or it hasn't changed as much as we thought it might.
In the time given, yeah, of course. And there's probably a discussion for a further discussion at some point.
Yes.
And you know, many of these film titles that we're going to sort of have a look at that are part of the retrospective. I mean, look back in Anger, Taste of Honey. They were plays before they were films. And so was this a case of filmmakers suddenly latching onto playwrights? You know, it seems that the writing capabilities seem to be in the theatre, and that the filmmakers then wanted to put it on the screen. Is there a theme there about the playwrights?
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. You're right, between the theatre and cinema, and a lot of the directors that we associate with the New Wave or the Angry Young Men movement were working in theatre or started out in theatre, then moved over to film, and it was in plays like Look Back in Anger that you could see this, and other playwrights, but you know, that's a separate. The theatrical story is slightly different. That were exploring those themes. We just talked about the post-war sort of existential themes. But I think that quite quickly the best filmmakers, and they're the ones that are in this festival package, realised that film had a language of its own that was really exciting, and so so they quite quickly they realised that you couldn't just mimic the theatrical stage and theatrical modes of production, which is what the filmmakers that came before had sort of done, just filmed plays. So yeah, it's part of that desire to see film as the most important art form of the 20th century, and to work with it and all its attributes to create new cinema.
Yeah, and just to go over some of the names that we're talking about here, and let's come back to the term new wave and some of these other terms that are bandied about: kitchen sink, social realism. We're looking at the group of filmmakers at the time: Lindsay Anderson, Tony Richardson, of course, who was born in Bradford, John Schlesinger, Carol Rees, and Lorenzo Mazzetti. And you know, that's the cluster of filmmakers that have been referred to in this retrospective. And that whole title of new wave, I mean, is it something, where did they take their inspiration from?
Well, I think it's quite interesting, because I think in film history, when you think of when you use the frame new wave, you think of the French post-war cinemas like Truffaut and Godard and the Cahiers du Cinéma crowd. And they obviously were hugely influential on 20th century and 21st century cinema. But actually, I mean, I think that if you look at we're talking about the British New Wave, it sort of seemed to run in parallel with that. I think that lots of the ideas and thoughts that were circulating was sort of part of the mood of the time, and that they did influence each other, I know, but I think it's too easy to say that the British filmmakers were just copying the French New Wave filmmakers. In actual fact, they were more influenced by the Avant Garde films of the early 20th century, especially the French ones. So Jean Vigo and René Clair, those sorts of experimental avant-garde French filmmakers, they were the big thing. That if you look at the writings that Lindsay Anderson and his colleagues were putting out at the time, it was definitely that was the big thing. That was the vehicle for change. We've seen these amazing, strange films that are made by individuals, often, artists, and we want to see if we can, bring that into post-war British filmmaking. So I think that you can't really underestimate that, the importance of the idea of the avant-garde in the development of this. And the new wave thing was kind of a good name for what came out of Britain, France, Germany, Eastern Europe. You know, those movements we're familiar with that we call New Wave cinema, sort of all came out of that same fascination with experimental film.
And can I touch on rebellion then, because there's an air of rebellion in a lot of the stories. Obviously, the angry young men, the phrase that was coined there was about rebelling often against the system and against what was expected of young men in post-war Britain. And is that true of the filmmakers as well, to some degree, that they were rebelling against sort of major studio output, and that technology had advanced to a point where actually you could, with a small team of people, if you knew the right connections, you know, you could muster enough budget together to make something on, you know, scaled back equipment. Was this a step in the direction of democratizing filmmaking, in that there was that rebellious streak that said, we've got stories to tell that possibly wouldn't have been told by the major studios? Not all of these are northern in their outlook, but some of them are very much focused on the north of England, and stories that prior to this time in history had not been shown on cinema screens. So I think that picking up that big flavour of rebellion on and off screen, really.
Yes.
And pioneers, I think you could definitely class these names that we've quoted there as pioneers in sort of independent filmmaking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's their kind of legacy in a way. But you're right about the rebellion thing. I mean, if you look at, I've got a copy of Sequence here, which was the magazine that Lindsay Anderson founded as part of the free cinema movement, which is, it's good that the festival has starts with a little, well, it's a rerun of the original free cinema package, those 3 films that started the free cinema movement. You know, in Sequence, Lindsay Anderson's kind of essays and what do you call them, sort of his editorial pieces are very critical of British cinema of the time. I mean, so he even, you know, describes Pinewood Studios working at Pinewood Studios as a depressing experience. That's a quotation, you know. So he's clearly attacking the British film industry as it stands. You know, Pinewood is a famous British studio, but he's already having a go at that. In the same way, Lorenzo Mazzetti, who you mentioned, says that free cinema gave a voice to those that didn't have one. So right from the start, it's about get rid of the past and start something new and fresh. And the only way to do that is to start, you know, on the ground with a small lightweight camera, no sound, no sync sound, and capture what's on the streets. So it's definitely and the subject matter of the films, I think, was rebellious. You know, this focus on youth culture, on jazz clubs, on kids, and then later in the features, you know, the lives of young individuals, young people, how their lives were being stifled by their parents' generation and by the experience of the Second World War. So yeah, absolutely. Of course, when they get older and start aging, they become more conservative, as people tend to do. But it's worth going back to these early writings on the free cinema writings to see just how angry they were, you know, about the world.
Yeah, and how, in your mind, really, and I suppose, how significant is this period in British filmmaking? Because it seems to be a kind of it seems like a turning point, really, for the liberalization, if you like, of voices. Not only because it introduced northern accents into some of the films. You look at Room at the Top, 1959, written by a librarian in Bingley, in part of Bradford. You look at Billy Liar, the use of the northern accent. I suppose this whole body of work, how significant is that to the British film industry?
I think it's had a huge impact, and perhaps not wholly positive. I mean, in the sense that that democratization, and I think that's taken a long time to work its way through. If you try and think of, you know, the aim of this movement was to democratize, as you say, and get more working class voices, more working class individuals to be creative and to tell their stories and to you know, show us the world from their perspective. That, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think that took a while to come through, and you're only seeing that with more recent filmmakers such as Shane Meadows, you know, where you've actually got those, and Andrea Arnold, perhaps, you've actually got those, you know, those voices coming directly from you know, the streets, if you like. What you had before was a more middle class perspective on working class life. It might have looked and sounded authentic, and the stories were authentic, but I don't know if, you know, my feeling is that didn't really change the industry that much, you know, and there's still and the stylistic legacy of the Angry Young Men, the new wave, the free cinema, was that, you know, that sort of documentary, cross between documentary and social realist storytelling is very much favoured now and promoted as what British cinema should be. And you've got interesting individuals like Mike Figgis, who's very critical of that, of saying there's too much kitchen sink. He calls it kitchen sink, which is a bit of a bad pun, but, you know, if you're trying to make something more that's outside of that social realist tradition, it's actually a bit harder. So yeah, it's definitely had a massive impact. The democratization thing, I don't know. I mean, those early free cinema films were made under the BFI's Experimental Film Fund, which I think also Ridley Scott's first film was as well, his first short. I don't know if that's still it. I don't know if you want to make an experimental film in the 21st century, I don't know if you can get funding for that from the BFI. So I think some things have changed, some things haven't.
I feel that that it's not continued, that there is still, it's still a very middle class, it feels like a very middle class industry.
Yes.
Filmmaking in the UK, certainly there are great opportunities that the British Film Institute and others provide, and television more so. I would say the likes of Channel 4 have got some great initiatives to welcome diverse voices and socio-economic across the board, but it is still seems to be very much dominated by people that have the means to be able to make content rather than people that have the talent. And we're still, as an industry in the UK, we don't have the breadth of voices telling stories that we should have. And maybe with this stuff to learn by looking back at this period in British filmmaking. And I wonder then, because it's not all about Angry Young Men, I want to single out Billy Liar, because much of Billy Liar, the majority of Billy Liar was filmed in Bradford, and we are speaking from Bradford, the world's first UNESCO City of Film. And you know that it kind of, for Billy Liar, there was a bit of a turning point, actually. It was the first film that I saw kind of as a teenager. Someone dragged me to the cinema to watch it, and I was like, why would I want to go watch that? It's a black and white film from the 60s. I weren't born when it was released in 1963. And you know, from the first scene of seeing my home city on screen, I was kind of captivated and thinking, oh wow, someone's made a film and Bradford's, you know, playing a starring role in it. But it also introduced that kind of comedy element to this kind of kitchen sink. You know, they were the dream sequences, and Billy Liar was a dreamer, and it was all done with, there was a tongue-in-cheek and there was a comedy effect, which didn't kind of exist in the other films that were quite serious. And I wonder also if you know, Billy Liar became a blueprint for sort of some kind of modern sitcoms, rom-coms, even soaps, you know, that kind of approach, really. And I did meet Tom Courtney when he came to Bradford once, and he was quite reluctant to talk about his time in Billy Liar. He was much more wanting to talk about stuff that he'd done recently. Of course he would, but I was a bit disappointed because it was all sort of like meeting a screen hero, you know.
Mm. Yeah, I think, yes, I mean, I think that it's easy to stereotype these films as gritty, sort of, you know, black and white documentary style, miserable, you know, film with miserable stories with miserable people, and that was never the intention. As I say, if you go back to the original idea behind free cinema, it was to make a new sort of cinema that used all the tricks that were possible, the special effects of dream sequences, the surrealism, the use of music to transform scenes, you know. So it's funny how that seems to be the image of it, and yet you're right when you talk about Billy Liar, that the reason that is so effective is because it's the virtuoso nature of the filmmaking in it. It draws in so many different aspects. You know, it has scenes that look very real and down to earth, and then it'll have an amazing dream sequence, usually filmed in the same sort of places. So I think it's important to hang on to that should be the message, really, is not make more depressing films, but make more innovative films. And I think that's what they tried to do. And as they went on, that most of those filmmakers that are in the program, the festival program, went on to make a diverse range of films, some which worked, some which didn't. But, you know, they were always striving to be different and adventurous. And that's the spirit of the age. And going back to your point about now, I mean, I think that it wouldn't be right to just blame the film industry, the British film industry on that, because there's been a closing down of opportunity in general. If you think about the post-war period, when there was a lot of enthusiasm for state initiatives and for for social mobility to take off and be integrated into policy, you saw this explosion of people from non-middle class backgrounds making music, making films, writing, making TV programs. And I think that's closed down a bit now. I think that those opportunities have become fewer, strangely. So there's that as well. That what's happening in the film industry sort of reflects that social conservatism.
And finally, then, in terms of this body of work for people that are studying film, in terms of film studies, and I suppose also, you know, in Bradford, of course, you run the masters in filmmaking at the University of Bradford. Is this a reference point that you would be steering film study students and even filmmakers at their master's level? Does this body of work come into that discussion at any point? Go and watch this film and see how they did it. Because we should just touch on, as part of the same question, this was before special effects. Green screen didn't kind of exist. People may have been dabbling with 3D at some point towards the end of this movement, but certainly these filmmakers, it was very low cost, low fi. It was low technology. And so is it a good reference point for people either studying the history of film and make, you know, like I say, master's students who want to make film? Would you be saying you ought to look at some of this work?
Yes, definitely. It's definitely still a good reference point in terms of what you can make a film about, the subject matter. So that, you know, it's easy to think I'm making a film, it's got to look like a Marvel production. And it's always good to say, it's a good grounding exercise to say, well, you could make a film about this as well, about something you've experienced, your life, something that you're drawing on that is personal. So that, in terms of the subject matter, it's a good lesson. But also the low budget thing, that you can't. The way to make a good film is not to have expensive equipment or really good equipment even. It's about the ideas, and they created these films, you know, purely on the originality of the concept and their creativity. And I think you've always got to go back to that. You know, you've always got to start there. So, I mean, for example, it's quite good to show them Ridley Scott's first short film that he shot in Hartlepool with his brother, because you know, most students' experience of these guys is of multi-million-pound large budget productions, and it's always good to say, yeah, but don't forget he started, or he or she started here where you are, making an experimental short film for no money, using their brother or somebody they know as actors, and look at what was possible. So I think it's on all sorts of levels, these films are really useful for film students and anyone interested in the art of film.
That's a fantastic way to sort of close, by going back to the beginning and looking at some of these early pioneers, if you like. Mark, thanks ever so much, and I hope the people at Seminci really enjoy this retrospective. And at some point, we'd love to come over and see you in Valladolid. So thanks again. Cheers.
Okay, thanks, David.